Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. As per usual, very, very much appreciated. Also, as per usual, the usual disclaimer: any comments or opinions that I make during this episode of the show are wholly my own and have nothing to do with the company that I work for. So today's episode of the show, still bit of an archive tasting theme happening at the moment, but I honestly, I promise that I will get round to sharing some new stuff with you guys in due course. Anyway, Cragganmore. This is only actually the second episode I've ever done of Cragganmore. The first episode I did was quite some time ago, and I actually only had one bottle of Cragganmore. I think it was Raymond Armstrong bottling, I think, but it was to basically pair up with the Usig Source water, rather than being a sort of an entire episode on Cragganmore. So this is the first time I've had the opportunity to do it, and this will probably be the last time, because independent bottlings of Cragganmore are, well, you know, like fairy dust. They just don't exist anymore, you know. I don't know whether it's basically because the distillery, well, it's obviously the distillery stopped selling casks some time ago, and I think the last time I came across a bottling of an independent bottling was about, I think 2014, I think. So obviously those casks that were out and about on the market have now since gone, and there's been no replacement, and well, it's a shame, I guess. Now, yeah, it is actually a shame, because I've always found that the independent bottlings of Cragganmore are far, far superior to this one, you know, the Distillery 12-year-old. And in actual fact, I've always found the Distillery 12-year-old just average. I mean, I know the late Michael Jackson absolutely raved about this. I wouldn't say it goes as far as saying it was one of his favourite malts, but he certainly raved about it. Dave Broom has gone on and on about how the founder of the distillery, John Smith, was a complete genius of what he did. And I just keep thinking, well, yeah, but it's just such an ordinary average. It's not good. No, sorry, no, it's not exceptionally good. It's not exceptionally bad. It's just average. And I suppose at the end of the day, it's always got to be a benchmark. There's always got to be an average whiskey. I mean, whenever, you know, I'm doing scoring for, say, you know, the World Whisky Awards or what have you, you know, you've always got in your mind the benchmark score of 7 is average, you know, and anything sort of obviously higher than 7 is better than average, I suppose, and anything lower than that is worse than average, I suppose. But no, kind of coming back to the distillery, one of the issues I think with the distillery, the genius of John Smith, is that he kind of wanted to create, I suppose, a sort of like an elegant style of spirit that had some meatiness, some weight to it. And I think this kind of tinkering has kind of almost kind of cancelled things out, if you see what I mean. Take, for example, the wash still. It's a big wash still, lots of copper contact to produce, you know, at least a starting point, a relatively sort of light spirit. But then you've got a steeply angled downward linarm, and then you've got a worm tub. So, you know, okay. So we're trying to get a bit of lightness, but we also want some weight. Also, if you look at the spirit stills as well, again, they have this kind of chopped off top, which again, more copper contact, lighter, elegant spirit. Again, a slightly offset downward angled linarm. I think it's downward angled linarm. But again, we're into another worm tub. So yeah, so what he's trying to do is, like I said, is produce a relatively light, a relatively highly rectified, elegant style of Speyside with a bit of meat on its bones, you know, maybe not quite so meaty and sulphury, I guess, as say something like Darwini to begin with, or Mortlach, for example. But you know, this is what he was obviously trying to do. And I've just found that with the Distillery 12-year-old, yeah, okay, you get a bit of that kind of coming through, but it's just sort of not particularly exciting. It's okay, it's average, you know. And I suppose you could argue there's nothing wrong with being average. Somebody has got to be average. Somebody's got to be the benchmark against which everything else is measured. So, you know, that, I guess, is a bit like John Smith's legacy. John Smith has created the ultimate benchmark whiskey in a roundabout kind of way, if you see what I mean. Now, I'm hoping that today's episode of the show will kind of just show the fact that, you know, the distillery can produce some wonderful spirit. You know, the independent single cask bottlings I've often found have been absolutely stunning. I mean, it's been the odd one or two, I guess, that again kind of fall into the sort of average, ordinary kind of category. But, you know, it's been a while certainly since I've tasted the Distillery 12-year-old. So I think I'm going to shut up and let's have a look at the lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with the Distillery 12-year-old. It's the obvious place to start with. It is their flagship bottling. It's the bottle that you're most likely to come across, and it's going to sort of be the benchmark, if you see what I mean. The next bottle we'll be looking at is the first of the independents. This is an AD Rattray single cask Cragganmore, 12-year-old. It was distilled in 1997, bottled in 2009. The sample itself was actually at 58.4% rather than 46, and it's a single bourbon cask, 1491. So like I said, it was bottled at 46%. The second bottling we're looking at again is another AD Rattray bottling. This is in their individual cask bottling range. A 14-year-old, bottled at 49.8%, distilled in April of 1993, bottled in September of 2007. And yes, I have smelt it, and I'm stunned that it's not kind of gone off to Cragganmore heaven. You know, it's still absolutely fine even after all this time. So it's cask 1910, and like I said, bottled at 59.8%. Next bottling we'll be looking at is a Malts of Scotland 15-year-old, again a bourbon cask, MOS 14015, distilled in 1999, bottled in 2014 at 53.5%. Last of the independent bottlings is a McKillop's Choice 23-year-old. Now you really don't see Cragganmore about with that kind of age, apart from obviously the last one, which we'll get onto. This is a single bourbon cask, again 1418, distilled in 1990, bottled in 2014 April, and bottled at 56.4%. And the final bottling is I don't even know how much that retailed for on release or what it's retailing for now, but one imagines silly money. This is the Special Releases Cragganmore. This is from 2014. It's a 25-year-old. It was distilled in 1988 and bottled in 2014, and features spirit aged in American oak and refill European oak. Now, this is the interesting thing is that predominantly bourbon, and that's a nice thing about the distillery. Yeah, alright, Diageo doesn't really do an awful lot with the spirit, aside from the 12-year-old, the distiller's edition, and every year, well, as far as I'm aware, every year a special releases bottling, pretty much like most of their distilleries. In actual fact, they just kind of let them get on with it. I mean, you can argue there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not particularly, like I say, it's not particularly exciting, is it really? But anyway, we're not here to sort of discuss the whys and wherefores of Diageo. We're here to taste some whiskey, or at least I am anyway, so I'm going to make a start. Okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on the 12-year-old. Okay, it's better than I was expecting. It's got some of that kind of honeyed, weighty character that one was expecting. There's some barley, touch of oak. There's quite a sort of an interesting sort of almost saline minerality, which is not something that I've often found in Cragganmore. So this is actually actually a bit of a surprise. I mean, what's more of a surprise, it's only a 20 cl bottle as well, and we all know that sometimes less than perfect spirit gets put into the smaller bottles. In this instance, I have to say that there's absolutely nothing wrong with this nose at all, and yeah, alright, it's still averagey, I guess, but I think this is probably one of the, certainly the nose is one of the most appealing 12-year-olds that I've come across. There's a slight wet tea leaf note coming through now. Anyway, let's see what Pat's on. A lot of creamy oak, a lot of oak in actual fact, some barley, again honey, it's got a lovely weight to it. It's a bit short. The problem is, of course, it's 40%. I think if it was 46%, again you'd get a bit more of a kick at the finish. It would be a bit more spicier. I mean, there's a little wood spice there. I mean, the palate is again okay, you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it at all. It's inoffensive, you know. You could give a bottle of this or a dram of this to anybody that likes whiskey and nobody would be offended by it whatsoever. It's perfectly okay, but you know, you just feel that it could be more than what it actually is, and maybe that is a little less oak or a little less active oak possibly, maybe 46%, maybe not chill filtering it. That would probably be a big game changer as far as I can see, because you know there's obviously something really pleasant going on here, but you just get the feeling that you think, oh, there just could be so much more. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the indie bottlings. This is the AD Rattray 12-year-old, so definitely we can say no filtration whatsoever. Let's see what the nose gives us. Again, quite a bit of oak, quite a bit of honey, very much in the mould of the 12-year-old distillery bottling, but it's just more going on. There's a little bit of citrus, there's a touch of grass, even a little bit of tropical weighty fruit, and it's obviously, this is showcasing the style of the distillery quite well. The fact that it's got the slightly lighter, grassier elements, but it's got the weightier honeyed elements as well from the worm tubs. It's got a lovely depth to it. So yeah, this is certainly a step above and a step up, and just showing you that maybe the spirit isn't quite so average. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Okay, so it kicks off with a little bit of oak, coffeed oak, a little bit of tannin, moves into the sort of grassy, spey kind of character. The honey then follows in through that. It picks up weight as the palate kind of goes along. It's quite restrained, certainly for a cask strength. It's not kind of overly masking the finish. It is emphasising the wood spices really pleasantly on the finish, and again it's got a nice weight to it, a nice length and a good finish, and it just shows you, I think, that this is the 12-year-old. This is what the distillery 12-year-old should really be like. It should have this level of not necessarily, obviously not cask strength, because that would make it too expensive, but it certainly shouldn't be filtered, and it certainly should be bottled at 46%, and you would get something more akin to this particular bottling than what you do have. So right, okay, so let's move on to the 14-year-old. So this is 59.8%. Let's see what the nose gives us. Again, it's like the previous bottle, like the 12-year-old, but just got that little bit more maturity, a little bit more depth, a little bit more honey, some toffee, bit of citrus. Again, it's a pleasant whiskey. It's lovely. It's pleasant. You know, I mean, we're not talking sort of overly complex. So we're talking, you know, I would guess we're talking an 8 here. I would say an 8.1, 8.2 possibly. So we're talking pretty good, you know, because a score above 8 is going to be really quite impressive. And yeah, it delivers, and that's what you want really. And again, it's just showing that the spirit has a little bit more than you would have thought just from tasting the distillery bottling. Anyway, let's see what passes out. Again, quite weighty, quite full, honeyed, intense citrus, spice, lime, orange on the finish. Wow, spiciness is just off the scale. That's the alcohol, obviously, emphasising that. Lovely tingling character. And again, there's that little sort of almost salty mineral kind of note right on the aftertaste. So again, it's showing that the spirit itself does have some character, has some interest. Again, maybe not overtly complex, but you know, again, like I keep saying, this is just showcasing that the distillery has a lot more to offer than you would actually expect from tasting the Distillery 12-year-old. Right, let's move on to the Malts of Scotland bottling. This is the 15-year-old and bottled at 53.5%. Let's see what those gives. Quite alcoholic, actually. More citric, more grassy, crisper, fresher. There's a little bit of a neutral spirit note kind of coming through. I'm getting a bit of rose petal, which is quite a surprise for something of this age. Wouldn't have expected that. A little bit of barley, a little bit of honey, a little bit of oak. So this one is going slightly against the grain. It certainly doesn't have the weight or the heaviness of the previous, or the honeyed weightiness of the previous bottlings. Which is again one of the wonderful things about single cask bottlings, isn't it? You know, touch of pepper maybe. It's a little, like I say, it's a little neutral and a little spirity, and a little bit overly youthful. So pass on. Big buttery oak, and then it's kind of spirit, rose petal marm, a little bit of honey. It just feels a lot younger than 15. It's just, I don't think this was anywhere near ready for being bottled, to be frankly honest with you. I think you could have left this in the cask for at least another 5 years. And I got rid of that kind of youthful rose petally kind of character, and maybe it would have put on a little bit more weight. Difficult to say. I suspect it would have probably sort of stayed in this kind of quite citric spey kind of character, and I don't think the weight would have probably come through. But then again, you know, if you'd have given us another 5 years in the cask, you might have started to get a little bit mature oak, a little bit more sawdusty oak notes kind of coming through. And so, although I don't think this is a particularly bad bottling in itself, I really think this had been bottled too soon. And you can understand why it was bottled. You know, they looked at the inventory and thought, right, well, Cragganmore, 15 years old, that's bound to be ready for bottling. And, you know, if I'd have been, you know, nosing this and sort of, you know, I would have said, definitely not, no, give that another 5 years at least. Or at least come back to that in about 2 or 3 years, because that's nowhere near ready yet. And this is the thing with whiskey. Whiskey isn't sort of like, you know, you can't just plot it on a graph. You know, you can't just basically go, well, you know, it's 10 years old, it's ready for bottling, it's 15, it's etc. etc. You know, it's a living entity, and it does its own thing. And sometimes, you know, it kind of throws you a bit of a curveball, you know. And sometimes you just have to be patient and bottle things at the right time, and I think this one wasn't bottled at the right time. But yeah, that's just my opinion, isn't it? And not the opinion of the company that I work for, I hasten to add. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Mackillops Choice. So the 23-year-old, hopefully this shouldn't be, this should be ready for bottling, shall we say. Anyways, 56.4%. Now, weighty. This is actually really quite dark, and really malty and almost treacly, you know. So here we go. Here we're getting the sort of like the maturity of the spirit really coming through. There's a little bit of a herbal note, a little bit of kind of green tea, possibly. It's certainly doesn't have the sort of fresh citric character of its youth, or the overt honey. We're now really into the sort of, you know, the mature character of how Cragganmore develops once it's been in the cask for a good couple of decades. And again, there isn't a huge amount of complexity happening here. It's mature, it's interesting, it's a good spirit. I can't say that enough, but again, you know, it's not really that complex, but what it delivers really quite pleasantly. So let's see what the parts like. Again, dark, malty, a little bit of treacle, baked fruit, malt, walnut shell. Obviously, there's no sherry notes. Obviously, it's no dried fruit. Well, there is a little bit of tropical fruit. There's a little bit of old honey, sort of waxy old kind of honey, I suppose you would say. Not a huge amount of oak. The oak doesn't seem, it's probably, I guess the oak character has kind of come and gone with this particular spirit, so we're kind of like, you know, getting really a real insight into how the spirit actually matures and what it's like at this kind of age, and it's really intriguing, it's interesting. Again, I don't think this would have been a cheap bottling, and you'd have to sort of decide for yourself whether sort of you were going to fork out, well, I don't know, 3 figures for an interesting experience. But yeah, I think it's really intriguing, but it again doesn't really have the complexity. But there you go. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Special Releases 25-year-old. Now, having just tasted the 23-year-old, the Mackillops Choice bottling, you kind of ask the question, well, if we're adding in a little bit of a sherry cask here, is this going to add a little bit more complexity, a little bit more interest? Well, we shall find out, I suppose. And yeah, you can smell the sherry. I mean, it's not a monstrous sherry. It's got that oxidised kind of, almost kind of fino, grapey sort of note in actual fact. It's got a lovely maturity. Again, I'm getting that sawdusty American oak. I'm getting honey, slightly tropical fruit, banana, apricot, a little bit of creamy oak. Okay, I'm going to put my neck out and say this is a very impressive bottling. It has a little bit more complexity than any of the other ones. It's got a little bit of waxy citrus. So, you know, this is probably the most successful bottling of the whole lot, it has to be said. I mean, well, you'd bloody well hope so, really, wouldn't you, at the end of the day? Because again, I can't imagine this was a particularly cheap cheap bottling. Certainly not with Diageo's pricing model anyway. Oops. Can't be critical of anybody, can I, really? Anyway, yeah, so kind of coming back to the whiskey, forgetting about the pricing and all that kind of stuff, it's bloody good. I mean, it really is quite impressive, it has to be said. Let's see what it passes on. Damn, that is good. That's a lovely mouthful. So it kind of kicks off with barley, creamy oak, mature oxidised fruit, little bit of honey. It's got some weight to it, but again, we're not talking as weighty as it was when it was younger. We're now getting the mature sort of like oxidised fruit character coming through. A little bit of dried fruit from the sherry. But the emphasis is certainly on the American oak. I mean, whoever put this blend together did a fantastic job as far as I can see. Like I said, emphasis fully on the American oak with a backing up of a little bit of dried fruit from the sherry. Again, wonderfully mature. Yeah, I mean, that is sensational stuff. That is stunningly good. Again, you could argue it might not be the most complex of spirit, but it is the most complex of all of these bottlings, shall we say, and it's obviously this is what it takes to get some complexity out of Cragganmore, is age it for a considerable length of time and use a little bit of sherry. But then I guess you could argue that there are a number of other distilleries that fall into exactly the same kind of criteria, that's what their spirit really needs at the end of the day. And I still stand by my feelings that Cragganmore, certainly at the lower end, at the sort of 12-year-old end of the spectrum, is really a bit of it's an average whiskey. But it does show that even an average whiskey can be pretty stunning given a certain set of circumstances. So yeah, really interesting. Right, okay, so a big thank you to all of the companies that supplied the samples for today's episodes, the show, to AD Rattray, to Malts of Scotland, to McKillop's Choice, obviously the distillery bottlings. I think one was a sample from the Whiskey magazine, and obviously I purchased the 12-year-old, so you know, I thought it was really interesting tasting, to be honest with you. Yeah, okay, so the 12-year-old, this was actually quite a good bottling of the 12-year-old, probably the best bottling I've tasted, it has to be said, which is really bizarre because I was not expecting that from a 20cl bottling. So, you know, at least in this instance, you have to say hats off to Diageo for not dumping rubbish spirit into smaller bottles. So, yeah, like I say, always say, praise where praise is due. The AD Rattray bottling 12-year-old, that is what the 12-year-old should be, really, in essence. Not cask strength, obviously, but it should be unfiltered. It should be 46%, and then you might get something that's a little bit more intriguing, a little bit more interesting. Again, it didn't really have a huge complexity to it, and like I've said, I don't think the spirit itself has an intrinsic complexity. 14-year-old, like I said, like the 12-year-old, just a little bit older. Still an absolutely pleasant bottling. The Malts of Scotland bottling just wasn't ready, and it is a classic, just a classic example of you shouldn't pay attention to the age of a spirit. You should always kind of judge it on its actual character for whether it's actually ready for bottling or not. No argument with the Mackillop's Choice. I mean, that was definitely ready for bottling, and it showed a slightly different side to Cragganmore, that sort of darker, slightly maltier character. This is obviously how it matures. So yeah, really quite impressed with that. The special releases bottling, well, obviously star of the show, has to be said. It was really very, very impressive, and just showing that sort of what Cragganmore can eventually become, given a bit of age and a little bit of sherry as well. And you're probably surprised to hear me sort of saying that I think it needs a little bit of sherry, but that's, you know, I'm not anti-sherry, never have been. Sometimes you just need that little bit of extra, an extra element, shall we say, which the sherry can deliver when used in a judicious amount. And certainly I think that the special releases bottling is absolutely is testament, A, to the skill of whoever blended it, and B, the fact that, you know, you use a little soupçon of sherry cask matured spirit and it can go a long way. And yeah, there you have it. That's this week's episode of the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's always nice when you do a tasting and it kind of reinforces your beliefs, should we say. Some might say prejudices, but I wouldn't. I would say beliefs. Yeah, like I said, I don't think the 12-year-old Cragganmore is bad bottling. Like I said, it is average, and at the end of the day, something has to be average and something has to be a benchmark against which everything else is judged, I suppose. So yeah, there you go. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it, and don't know what I'm going to be doing next week, but I'm hopeful that it will include something new, shall we say, maybe something borrowed and nothing blue, I imagine, but there you go. Anyway, so until next week, all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dramming.